effect it is having on our nation and on our democracy. We expect to hold another hearing on March 25th with the CEOs of Facebook, Google, and Twitter to further discuss these issues. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Joe Orlando at the email address we have provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. First, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before us today. Today, we are talking about media outlets such as cable news, broadcast news, and radio, and the role they play in disseminating disinformation and fomenting extremism. My hope is that our witnesses can help the subcommittee better understand the current media ecosystem, how we got here, and potential solutions. I doubt that any members here are naive about the media. This is the industry that coined the term, if it bleeds, it leads. But to the degree to which Americans have become awash in disinformation and the profound events that our country has recently gone through require examination and evaluation of this industry. This week marks a grim milestone for our nation, as 500,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. That matches the American death toll in Vietnam, Korea, and World War II combined. This pandemic has touched almost every aspect of American life and taken so many friends and loved ones from us, including from one of the witnesses here today who tragically lost her father. The real tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this bad. But some in the media sought to downplay this virus from the beginning. They refused to acknowledge how deadly it was. They criticized stay-at-home orders. They mocked social distancing. They told audiences that they didn't need to wear masks. All of these were scientifically validated steps that could have saved lives and prevented so much anguish and grief. In the midst of this pandemic, we also saw the rise of the Stop the Steal movement, fomented by former President Trump and propagated by members of the media that sought to dispute the outcome of our elections and overturn our democratic process. As we all know, this led directly to the horrific events of January 6th, the attack on our Capitol and our democracy by insurrectionists motivated by former President Trump. 5 lives were lost that day, and more have been lost since. A Capitol police officer was murdered. Others were savagely attacked, beaten, and called vile racial epithets. All of our lives were put at risk, as was the vice president's. The First Amendment protects the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech. And the freedom of speech encourages us to ask tough questions about what is going on in the media, what is motivating the tidal wave of disinformation that is putting the lives of so many Americans and ultimately our democracy at risk. Partisanship and polarization in the media has been building for years. But these more recent events reflect a frightening escalation. As Ms. O'Brien points out in her testimony, media companies have increasingly set aside journalistic standards to chase audience share and higher profits. Ms. Bell's testimony discusses the decline of local media and local newspapers, once the lifeblood of our democracy, and now rapidly accelerated by the financial hardships of COVID. These changes have given rise to national media entities that are more focused on the kind of tactics we see from social media companies. They engage their viewers by enraging them and further dividing us and our nation. We have also seen the rise of news as entertainment, where the claims of anchors and commentators are likened to performance art. When they are challenged in court, the lawyers from their own networks even claim that no reasonable person could believe these people are speaking the truth or reporting facts. When truth becomes a commodity to be traded upon for profit, and facts and consequences don't matter to those who report them, our democracy is undermined. It is the responsibility of this subcommittee to hold these institutions to a higher standard. Thank you, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and I yield the remainder of my time to my friend and colleague, Ms. Eshu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing today. Let me put it bluntly. Misinformation is killing Americans and damaging our democracy. We have to examine how conspiracies and lies convince people to dismiss public health measures and refuse life-saving vaccines. This is not about left versus right. This is about life and death. Similarly, the January 6th insurrection was built on a foundation of lies about mail-in ballots, voting machines, and election results. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from enacting laws abridging the freedom of speech, and I'm an ardent supporter of it. It does not, however, stop us from examining the public health and democratic implications of misinformation. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing today, and I yield back. I also thank the witnesses who are with us today and anxious to hear from them.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair yields back. Chair recognizes my good friend and colleague, Mr. Latta, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Bob, you need to unmute.
There we go. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, for today's hearing. I appreciate you yielding me the time. And I also want to thank our witnesses who are appearing before us today on this hearing focused on disinformation and extremism in the media. While disinformation, misinformation, and extremism in the media are all serious issues that this subcommittee should be examining in a bipartisan way, unfortunately, today's hearing is not about that. Earlier this week, several of my colleagues sent a disturbing letter to private companies asking them questions that imply that these companies should stop carrying certain news content. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter that letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I think, my friend, as the title of the hearing indicates, the majority's intent behind today's hearing is to fan the flames of silencing certain viewpoints in America by trying to suppress and censor speech, a concept that has the potential to destroy our democracy. This is deeply troubling. It should be deeply troubling to everyone here today. With this goal at hand, we are embarking upon a dangerous path of using this committee to attack the foundation of fact and further diminish trust in journalism. The antidote to bad speech is more speech. Rather than suppressing speech and viewpoints that we don't agree with, we should be encouraging more speech and conversations between one another. Sadly, it appears we're doubling down on encouraging the cancel culture of the left instead of identifying bipartisan solutions to encourage and support factual, local, national news. We are all facing unprecedented challenges in this country, which includes work to combat a once-in-a-century pandemic. There's never been a more important time for journalism to be more accurate and reliable. Having reliable news sources that report factual content that can even be a matter of life and death. The damage done to our democracy by further dividing our nation and ignoring the patently false and inaccurate information coming from the media outlets cannot be understated. Before I close, I'd like to bring to light just one of the most recent examples we have seen in the press concerning the attacks on the Capitol grounds on January the 6th. Republicans and Democrats, including myself, have condemned the events of January the 6th. It is disturbing to say the least. To insinuate responsibility for the mob violence that took place that day lies only with the media and not with the individuals who carried out these actions and committed crimes. That is flat out wrong. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to our whip, Mr. Scalise from Louisiana.
Well, thank my friend from Ohio for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing and our witnesses as well. And clearly, we've all been very vocal in denouncing the events that happened on January 6th. Is a clear example of not only mob violence, but also how political discourse can get out of control. But for anybody to just try to suggest that discourse started getting out of control on January 6th, would be disingenuous when you look at where we've gotten and how far this has come. I want to take you back to June 14th, 2017, a day that a gunman walked onto a baseball field and shot at over a dozen members of Congress, including myself. There's been a lot of investigation into it. The FBI did a report. The gunman was motivated by hypercharged rhetoric that he was hearing from the left, from high prominent elected officials, as well as media personalities. In fact, Mr. Chairman, there is a report that the FBI did where they included some of the writings of the gunman, where he talked specifically about the people who motivated him and inspired him to commit this shooting, which would have been very deadly if he was successful without the bravery and heroism of Capitol Police. I would like to ask unanimous consent that this be entered into the record, which is the FBI, some of the FBI excerpts from his writings. I enter that not to say that I blame those people that he mentions for his motivation. I say this to let you know that I don't blame those other people. I blame the shooter. The shooter's the one who should be held accountable, and I'm very clear about that. But it's an example that we all need to be aware of our rhetoric and can all be doing a better job of toning down the rhetoric. But we also need to call it out where we see it, not just on the other side of the aisle, but on both sides. Just as I called out January 6th activities, I called out the violence I saw over the summer when through hypercharged rhetoric, people were burning down cities, were killing cops, killing other people. Let's be consistent in calling it out, not trying to suggest disingenuously that it only comes from one side of the political spectrum. Let's be fair and recognize we can all do a better job of encouraging the rhetoric to be toned down, and we all need to call out political violence wherever we see it, because it's not acceptable in America from the left or the right. With that, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Just to inform members, a vote has been called. We are not going to recess at all during votes. So as members that have some time before they ask questions may want to go down and take their votes, and we'll just proceed. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me speak for myself and hope, and also for all Democrats, and say that we're all staunch defenders of the First Amendment and its mandate that Congress make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The First Amendment prohibits us from passing laws that inappropriately limit speech, even when it is controversial or even partisan. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the spread of misinformation that causes public harm. Putting a spotlight on the issue and having an open dialogue is exactly what the Founding Fathers envisioned, because it may help us solve a very dangerous problem. And we owe it to our constituents and to our democracy to examine how and why disinformation is being aired on traditional media and social media. And that means we must ask uncomfortable questions, like whether these media outlets, for example, have an incentive to air extreme conspiratorial programming or content, and how journalists can help each other find ways to cover controversial topics in a way that doesn't undermine our democratic structure and health. And there are no easy answers, but we have to obviously try to find them. In my opinion, there are too many traditional media outlets that have yet to seriously wrestle with these questions. Very few have acknowledged their role in spreading deadly misinformation. And some have tried to self-correct, but only after the damage has been done, or only after faced with public backlash or legal action. So this debate, in my view, that you're having, Mr. Chairman, today is our best hope for addressing one of the challenges confronting our country, and a hope that we can have a smart and sensible discussion today, because there just is so much at stake. Now, going back to the assault on the Capitol on January 6th, it was an abhorrent attempt to overturn a free and fair election. And there was months of disinformation about the presidential election results that helped flame that attack. I understand when our whip and Mr. Lattis say that, that they've all condemned what happened on January 6th, and I respect that. And of course, I still think about you, Steve, and what happened to you at that game, and your injury and your remarkable recovery. But my point is that we still have to look at these incidents and see what brought them about and what role the media played in causing these kinds of incidents. It doesn't mean that just because they occurred and we say that they're terrible and that they shouldn't have happened, that we don't look into this. And the problem is that we have this daily and in some cases deadly dose of disinformation and extremist content that's being amplified by some of our most longstanding media sources. It can be broadcast, it can be cable, it can be radio. And I just think that this disinformation and extremism is a threat to the country, both collectively and individually. Targeted Vice President Pence individually. They had the gallows set up out there for him, our Republican vice president. So disinformation has undoubtedly contributed to the rapid spread of COVID-19 as well. And 500,000 Americans have died without regard to whether they are Republicans or Democrats. Last summer, we examined the role of social media in spreading extreme content and dangerous disinformation. However, our media ecosystem involves both social media and traditional media outlets that are part of this vicious cycle of reinforcing conspiracy theories. So despite the rise of social media, we know that the majority of Americans get their news primarily from TV or radio. And over the past year, we've seen some of these outlets air programming that downplayed the seriousness of the COVID-19 pandemic, peddled ineffective treatments, mocked effective precautionary measures. Chairman Doyle mentioned this. And there are consequences to the constant airing of misinformation and false news. Some have tragically lost their lives because they relied on disinformation about COVID-19, including the father of one of the witnesses today. And for months, some of these outlets aired programming that falsely claimed the presidential election was stolen. We lost 5 lives that day as a result of the attack on the Capitol. Hundreds of people injured as a result of the Stop the Steal propaganda campaign that some of these media outlets encouraged and which ultimately led to the Capitol assault. And only after this violence did one broadcaster recognize the role that its programming played and asked its on-air personalities to stop claiming the election was stolen. So I just think there's a lot here that we have to look into. Let's try to do this in a smart and sensible way. And I do appreciate, Chairman Doyle, the fact that you're having this today. I think it's very important. I just realized that I was supposed to yield to Jerry, and now I didn't, Jerry. I'm sorry. We'll have to make it up to you somehow. I'm sorry. I didn't realize.
That's all right, Mr. Chairman. I'll hold you to that promise.
All right.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone and Chairman Doyle. In all my time on this committee, there's never been a more obvious, direct attack on the First Amendment. Despite what has been said, I want to be very clear. Condemning the January 6th attack and upholding truth and facts, it's a shared bipartisan goal. Unfortunately, that's not what this hearing is about. If the majority was really interested in a meaningful dialogue, you wouldn't schedule a hyper-partisan hearing to shame and blame. You wouldn't be sending letters pressuring private companies to block conservative media outlets. I'm not only disappointed in this hearing, I'm deeply troubled by it. Every journalist, from MSNBC and CNN to the New York Times, should be concerned by the majority's actions. And anyone who values free speech and a free press should be worried. Elected officials using their platform to pressure private companies to censor media outlets they disagree with? That sounds like actions from the Chinese Communist Party, not duly elected representatives of the United States Congress. Here we cherish free speech and a free independent press. We believe in dialogue and in the battle of ideas. Rather than censure and silence constitutionally protected speech, the answer is more speech. That's the American way.
Hard-hit populations. Today, many low-income Americans still lack access to this basic protection. That's why we're taking this thoughtful and targeted action to keep Americans safe. We will deliver more than 25 million masks across the country. These masks will be available at at more than 1,300 community health centers and around 60,000 food pantries. Any American who needs a mask will be able to walk into these health centers or food pantries and pick up a high-quality American American-made mask that is consistent with CDC guidance. This program is made possible through existing funding at HHS, and with this action, we are hoping to level the playing field, giving vulnerable populations quality, well-fitting masks. A couple other things. I know, lots going on today. I wanted to make sure you saw a letter released this morning by over 160 CEOs representing some of America's biggest and most respected companies, calling on Congress to act on the President's rescue plan. There is growing consensus across the country for this package, and that's reflected in polling showing a bipartisan majority of Americans back it. As the more than 160 business leaders put in their letter to congressional leaders, previous federal relief measures have been essential, but more must be done to put the country on a trajectory for a strong and durable recovery. Also, a winter storm update. Temperatures are back within normal ranges for this time of year across the states that have been impacted by the storm. That's, of course, good news. But water system outages and boil water advisories, although improving, remain an ongoing issue across the region, requiring additional federal support. Delayed shipments of COVID-19 vaccine doses are anticipated to be filled in the coming days, as we noted last week, and vaccination sites have reopened and are doubling up appointments to accommodate those canceled last week. All major airports are open. All rail carriers have returned to normal operations. Interstate and state highways are open. Transit agencies are returning to normal operations, and ports are operating under normal circumstances. Federal assistance continues. We noted the additional 31 counties yesterday, and of course, we'll continue to consider additional requests moving forward. Finally, to remain transparent with you and the American people, we wanted to share that the President tested negative for COVID-19 on Monday. We will venture to provide this update the following day in the future, but this is part of our regular COVID safety protocols that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. The entire White House complex, as you know, continues to adhere to strict mask wearing, social distancing, and other mitigation strategies. Okay, sorry, a few things at the top. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. On the masks, any sense of why the White House is using cloth masks instead of N95s, which are also made in America? We have supplies. And do you have a list of manufacturers of the masks?
Sure. Well, I would say that these masks are all adhere to CDC guidelines, and certainly they meet those requirements set by our federal standard. And just tell me your second question again.
A list of the manufacturers of the masks?
I don't have a list of those. I can see if there's more details we can provide.
Okay, and then separately, Vladimir Putin said today that Russia's going to redouble its efforts on opposing foreign powers who he says are basically trying to undermine Russia. Does the White House believe that tensions with Russia are increasing?
Well, we believe that certainly over the last several years, there have been more concerning steps that have been taken by Vladimir Putin and by members of the Kremlin, as the president has expressed during the campaign. And that is why he asked his national security team to launch a process of looking into not only reports of hacking around the 2020 election, but also the bounties on our troops that was of concern, of course, the SolarWinds hack, and to take a close look at that so we have our own assessment. As you know, the president also spoke with President Putin just maybe 2 weeks ago and did not hold back in expressing his concerns about the actions of his government. But we are letting that process see itself through. As I noted yesterday, it will be weeks, not months, before it's concluded, and we have more details about a response. Go ahead.
Thank you. So just wanted to see if you could confirm that the president is speaking with King Salman of Saudi Arabia today, and if he'll do that in advance of the report on Khashoggi coming out.
Well, as we've noted in the past, we remain committed to releasing through the DNI, of course, an unclassified report that we expect to happen soon. I don't have an updated timeline for you on that. I know there were also reports on a proposed call. We also expect that to happen soon. We're still in the process of scheduling when that will happen.
Okay. And what are they going to be talking about in that call?
Well, when we have the call and the president has the call, I'm sure we'll do a readout of it. Of course, we've had engagements at many levels with the Saudis to date, but we'll do a readout once we conclude the call.
Do you have a status update on Neera Tanden with all of the delays on Capitol Hill as far as her confirmation?
And tell me more about what you mean by that.
An update as far as whether you're going to withdraw that name. It doesn't seem like the votes are there for her at this point.
Well, let me first state that, as the president repeated yesterday, we're fighting for her nomination, and she and our team remain in close contact and close touch with senators and key constituency groups. She's an expert whose qualifications are critical during this time of an unprecedented crisis, and she has rolled up her sleeves. She's very engaged in doing outreach to senators, to members on the Hill, answering any questions they have and offering to do that, and we're doing the same. I know there was an announcement about a delay of a confirmation vote today, and they put out a statement to make clear that, of course, they're going to do due diligence, as are we, to continue that outreach and continue to fight for her nomination.
Follow, Jen.
Go ahead.
Jen, thank you. How big of a setback does the White House view the fact that the Senate committees have delayed the vote on her confirmation to be?
Well, again, they put out the statement from the leadership of the committee conveying clearly that they wanted to continue to do work to build support for her nomination.
Does the White House see this as a setback to Neera Tanden's confirmation?
I wouldn't put it in those terms. I think we are committed to continuing to fight for all of our nominees, continuing to do the outreach needed, to answer questions, to address concerns anyone has, to reiterate the qualifications of all of the nominees that the president has put forward, and to do due diligence in fighting for the team he's nominated.
Even if she is confirmed, does it undercut the president's budget agenda to have this confirmation delayed?
Well, as I noted a couple of times here, but it's worth repeating, Neera Tanden has a record of working with people who disagree with her, working with people who have different viewpoints and different objectives and priorities, and that's something she would certainly take into the job if she's confirmed.
And just one more, Jen. Richard Shelby has said he would support the confirmation of Shalonda Young. What is your reaction to that? Is she a potential replacement should Neera Tanden not follow through?
Well, there's one nominee to lead the budget department. Her name's Neera Tanden, and that's who we're continuing to fight for.
Discussions about Shalonda Young?
We are focused on fighting for the person the president has nominated. Go ahead, Caitlin.
On Neera Tanden, one more follow-up on that. Has she offered to withdraw her nomination yet?
We are working in close touch with Neera Tanden and with members of Congress on continuing to do the outreach and engagement to fight for her confirmation. That's where our focus is.
But no yes or no whether she's offered to withdraw.
That's not the stage we're in, Caitlin. Where the stage we're in is working to continue to fight for her nomination. And as you know, it's a numbers game, right? It's a matter of getting one Republican to support her nomination. We're continuing to do that outreach, answer questions they have, and continue to reiterate her qualifications.
And on the call with King Salman that's expected to happen, you said you're still working on scheduling it. Does President Biden want the Saudi Crown Prince to be on that call?
The president's intention, as is the intention of this government, is to recalibrate our engagement with Saudi Arabia and to have counterparts communicate with counterparts. And Prince Salman communicated with the Secretary of Defense. That's the appropriate line of communication. And the president will speak with the king at the appropriate time. It will be soon. And as soon as we have an update on that being finalized, and of course, when it happens, we'll provide you all with a readout.
I know that, yeah, they'll be speaking, but is he okay if he's on the call?
I would anticipate the call being directly with the king and a one-on-one call, or a call, of course, those would be the primary participants.
Okay, my last question is on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as it's moving toward authorization. It looks like Jeff Zients, the coordinator, said today they believe they're going to have between 3 and 4 million to ship pending authorization. That was initially supposed to be much higher, according to the contract that Johnson & Johnson signed with the federal government, closer to 10 million, I believe, in February. So is President Biden disappointed that Johnson & Johnson is not going to have closer to 10 million vaccines ready to go if and when they get authorization?
Well, Caitlin, we were surprised to learn that Johnson & Johnson was behind on their manufacturing. As you noted, it was kind of reported earlier to be about 10 million, and now it's more like 3 to 4 million doses that they would be ready to ship next week if they are moved through the FDA process, which is not yet concluded, just to note. And we are going to continue to work with them on ensuring that that can be expedited. So if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is approved. Go ahead.
I want to follow up on what you just said about recalibration with the Saudis. Is that the extent of the recalibration, just having the president deal directly with King Salman?
You say that MBS has been engaging with his counterpart at the Defense Department. If the U.S. government believes that Mohammed bin Salman was behind or in some way related to the death of Jamal Khashoggi, how can this administration continue to deal with him? And in what way do you intend to?
Well, I think we'll wait for the unclassified report to be released, which will be released through the DNI. And while I don't have an update on that, I expect that will be soon to speak further. And of course, when I talked about recalibration, I was referring to, of course, the counterpart to counterpart, because that was kind of how the question was posed. But, you know, we always look, the president is taking a fresh approach to how he engages with foreign leaders around the world, and different from the prior administration. And that means he will not hold back, and he will speak out when there are concerns he has about human rights abuses, about the lack of freedom of speech or the lack of freedom of media and expression, or any concerns he has. At the same time, we have a long relationship with Saudi Arabia. They are being attacked in the region, and that is certainly an area where we continue to work with them on. But I expect we'll have more to say when we get post the release of that report.
An unrelated question. What is this president's view toward the loyalty that teachers' unions should have towards students? This president is a strong supporter of unions, public sector unions. Is a teachers' union's obligation to the workers and their concerns about safety, or is the teachers' union obligation also to students?
Well, I can't speak to the obligations or I'm not a spokesperson for the teachers union. I'm a spokesperson for the President of the United States. So I can convey to you that his commitment is to the students and to the teachers and to the parents who want to have their kids back in school. And he wants to do that safely. And that's what his focus is on, and that's the role he can play from the federal government. Go ahead, David.
Jen, just back on the Saudi issue, I understand that until you've had the conversation, you're not going to talk much about the policy implications. The president did have some things to say during the campaign. He said, we were in fact going to make them pay a price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. And later he said there was little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. Any reason to believe his overall view of the Saudi government as a pariah and little redeeming social value has changed?
The questions about the harm of disinformation and extremist speech in our society. Yet I believe the speech controls pose far greater threats for our country than misguided or malevolent speech. Disinformation is a scourge in our society, but it's not a new scourge. As discussed in my testimony, the Constitution was not only written for times like these, it was written during times like these. At the start of the Republic, Republicans and Federalists were not trying to cancel each other in the contemporary sense. They were trying to kill each other in the actual sense. There was rampant conspiracy theories, and newspapers and pamphleteers were highly biased and partisan. This is also not the first time that people in power have declared that they can rid us of this meddlesome media. The question is, who will be the arbiter of truth in any public or private regime of speech regulation? The First Amendment limits the ability of the government to regulate or censor speech. Accordingly, the United States has been spared a history of a state media like China or Iran. Yet in the last few years, it has shown that there is no need for a central ministry controlling the media if there's a common narrative or bias among private companies that control communications. The reason that most of us have opposed state media controls is not simply because we disfavor state regulation of speech, but because we favor free speech. These companies can deny free speech more effectively, more efficiently than any state apparatus. We would achieve very little in our constitutional system if we allow politicians to achieve indirectly what they cannot do directly. Of course, external controls on speech seem trivial or inconsequential when the speech is not your own, and even less if it is speech that you abhor or despise. Europe has shown that speech regulation becomes an insatiable appetite. There's no evidence that European laws actually diminished hate speech. There's plenty of evidence that they diminish free speech. That impact's evident in recent polls out of Germany, where only 18% of Germans feel free to express their opinions in public, and only 17% felt free to express themselves in the internet. Now, of course, It's notable that Angela Merkel recently criticized the United States for its crackdown on free speech, particularly Twitter, and banning people as a real threat to free speech. This appetite for speech, limiting the speech of others, is evident in the United States. We've talked briefly about the recent letter to AT&T and other companies. I'd be happy to talk about that more. But to be honest, from the perspectives of free speech and the free press, the letter is not just chilling, it's positively glacial. I admit that I may be a relic in my views, but I continue to believe that the greatest protection against bad speech is better speech. Those seeking limits often speak of free speech like it's a swimming pool that must be monitored and carefully controlled for purity and safety. I view it more as a rolling ocean. It is indeed dangerous, but it's also majestic and inspiring. Its immense size allows for a natural balance. Free speech allows false ideas to be challenged in the open rather than driving dissenting viewpoints beneath the surface. However, free speech, like other constitutional values, requires a leap of faith, a faith not only in free speech, but in each other. Citizens are capable of educating and informing themselves. They do not need politicians or corporate filters to protect them from speech false or inciting. Roughly 70 years ago, Justice William Douglas warned that the restriction of free speech is the most dangerous of all subversions. It is the one un-American act that could easily defeat us all. Some of the measures being discussed this week have the potential to defeat us all. Once again, thank you for the honor of appearing with you and with my distinguished co-panelists. I'd be happy to answer questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Turley. We now recognize Ms. Urquiza for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone here for allowing me the opportunity to provide testimony. My name is Kristin Urquiza. I'm the co-founder of a grassroots nonprofit group called Marked by COVID, which my partner, Christine Keeves, and I founded. Mark Anthony Urquiza from COVID-19 on June 30th, 2020. He was 65. My father's story is tragic, yet it is not unique. Every single day since he has passed, I have spoken to people who have lost close family members and loved ones to COVID, and I am haunted by the eerie similarities between so many of us. Let me start by stating the obvious. The primary person and entity responsible for my father's death and hundreds of thousands of people in the United States is Donald Trump and his administration. This is why Marked by COVID is advocating for a commission to investigate the federal government's response to the pandemic thoroughly, so we know exactly what happened and why. However, crime and malfeasance aren't always committed by a single actor. Frequently, there are accomplices, enablers, and complicit parties. To the people in this room and this sacred body who blindly followed the president without questioning, who put party over country, you and your colleagues are enablers. To the media, and in particular cable news, you were complicit. These actors may not have pulled the gun that pointed at my father's head, but they indeed drove the getaway car. My beloved father loved his country, and he instilled in me this: during times of crisis, it is our duty to our country to turn to our leaders for information on what to do to keep one another and our democracy safe. So on May 5th, 2020, when the former president made his first public appearance from his quarantine in Phoenix, Arizona, and said it was time to open up, my dad listened. When Arizona Governor Doug Ducey flipped the switch on May 15th, reopening the state with absolutely no safety measures in place, my dad noticed. But let me be abundantly clear. My father was not a personal friend of Donald Trump nor Doug Ducey. Like everyone I know, my dad received his information through an intermediary, and his media of choice was Fox Cable News and Arizona's KTAR News 92.3 radio station. Also, let me be clear, my parents never questioned the reality or the severity of the pandemic, nor the efficacy of simple public health safety measures like wearing masks. But that all started to change after the president's visit to Arizona. My dad then started to say to me, Kristin, why would the governor or the president say that it's safe if it is not safe? And you don't have to dig very deep to find both President Trump and Doug Ducey pushing that we have nothing to fear, and that if you do not have an underlying health condition, it is safe to be out there. The people in charge, the people he trusted and voted for, told him over and over again that he didn't have to worry. And I did my best to fight back, but there is no way that one person can compete with the microphone of the office of the president, nor the propaganda machine that has become Fox Cable News. He died on June 30th alone, with just a nurse holding his hand. This should not have happened. It did not have to be this way. The president and his enablers lied repeatedly, and that disinformation was allowed to litter the airways and created the exact right conditions for the virus to thrive and for hundreds of thousands of people to pass away needlessly. I said it earlier and I'll repeat it. The media didn't pull the trigger, but they drove the getaway car. Cable news channels like Fox News are complicit. Isabel Obi Papadimitriou, Charles Krebs, Genevieve Martinez, Dr. Gay Griffin Snyder, Mike Horton, Kathy Jones, Calvin Schoenfeld, William Kirby, Manuel Urquiza, Mark Anthony Blackjack Urquiza, and more than 500,000 other names. Every single one of them deserves to be said out loud in this hearing. All irreplaceable, all dead. Thank you for allowing me to share our Marked by COVID story and holding this hearing to address the role of media fanning the flames of disinformation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we have our last presenter. Ms. Bell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member and distinguished members of the subcommittee, and thanks for having me here today to speak about this incredibly important issue. I also want to thank the journalists and researchers working in this area with an extraordinary lack of data, and I hope that this is something that we can also address, which is why we know so little about what actually happens in our information environment when we have such abundant material often trapped in the servers of our largest technology companies. We've heard about how both the tragic existential events that faced America this year were accompanied by the circulation of widespread and often politicized misinformation. Conservative cable news channels often amplified a president who was notorious for spreading misinformation himself. He had 30,000 fact-checked statements during his presidency, 15,000 of the false statements during his presidency, 15,000 of those occurred in this last crucial year. Whilst we're here to discuss the role of the news media, I just want to emphasize that the digital context is just as important. The influence of what was once thought of as mainstream media, I don't think can be any longer separated in any way from the digital environment in which we all swim. Misinformation, it's a systemic problem, it affects all, and I wholeheartedly endorse the view that this is not a partisan issue. We see it in different geographies and right across the political spectrum operating in the same way. We see content which is produced perhaps by cable news can be amplified and discussed by white supremacists and militia groups that lurk in online corners of the internet. We see conspiracy theories about the coronavirus that make it to cable talk shows that still exist uncorrected on social media. Broadcasts that get just a few thousand viewers in real time circulate clips and posts that reach millions more. Some of this is the result of policy decisions and an environment that we've created for a thriving media market. A 40-year path of deregulation has transformed the US media landscape in both economic and political terms. Rollback of regulations has liberated the market, but taken with it some of the safeguards and support for a more varied, localized media. Digital media and the lowering of barriers has helped elevate previously marginalized and ignored voices, and it's made our public discourse much more diverse. But an open market without regulation will always favor bad actors over good. In financial markets, this is known as Gresham's law. Those with ethics are inhibited in ways that those without ethics are not. It's also worth saying that in an open market, we talk about more speech being a corrective. Too often, voices we really need to hear are silenced by harassment and drowned out by electronic amplification. Whilst all news, national news media, and particularly polarized opinionated news has flourished, local trusted news provision has really declined, as we've already heard. Local newsroom staff have halved in the past 15 years, and there are now over 1,800 markets without any local news at all in the United States. Unfortunately, coronavirus has been an accelerant for this. This is something we track at my research center at Columbia University. We know that we've lost another 100 or so outlets just in the course of the last year. There's really a need for American democratic institutions to identify and work together on the priorities that would mitigate this kind of extremism and misinformation. Solutions encouraging a different news media environment should be central, I think, to our thinking. Finding the means to fund and sustain more independent local reporting are a burning priority. Civic journalism representative of the communities it serves should be established and strengthened through a reform agenda centered, I think, on the information rights of all communities. We talk about the information needs, but I think that they should really be thought of rights. The right to hear good information. Mistrust of the media doesn't just exist in polarized pockets either. It also exists within communities who've been ignored or misrepresented by mainstream media for decades. The opportunities to correct this cannot and should not be ignored. And I believe that they're an essential part of throwing a fire blanket on these flames that we're talking about today of extremism and division. I also believe that it is not just down to individual choice or even the free market and choices made by companies. I believe that there is a policy role here which is not about infringing the First Amendment, but which is about strengthening ways in which we can have a more vibrant, truthful news environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. And that concludes our witnesses' statements. And so we're now going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I'm going to start by recognizing myself, but I wanted Mr. McNerney to go that I'm going to cut myself off at 4 minutes and give you my last minute to do what you were going to do before, which I forgot to give you the minute, all right? So let me start out by saying I wanted to know if of either Ms. O'Brien or Ms. Bell, are there any organizations that have found a way to properly police disinformation and deal with public figures inclined to spread it? And are there any best practices that news organizations can employ for this purpose? Quickly, since my time is now even more limited.
I can be in very quickly, and then I'll hand it off to Professor Bell. I would say that policing is not the word that I would use. I think my call would be for news organizations themselves to recognize the dangerous position that they have put themselves in and their viewers in. And I would say the list of things in my written testimony and what I read would be the things that you can do. In some ways, it's very simple. Do not book liars on the air. That is not brain surgery. People who lie, people who traffic in misinformation and disinformation should not be booked on the air. That would be a very good place to begin.
Thank you. Ms. Bell?
There's a burgeoning area of research and civil society organizations. There's a research group actually convened around the election called the Election Integrity Partnership, which looked at both the roots of this and discussed ways in which things could be mitigated. It's what we work on again at Columbia. I think that when you say, is there any sort of successful strategies, as Soledad said, there are a whole range, I think, starting with journalists really recognizing how their work can be used in different contexts, right from the headline or the push alert that you get on your phone through to when you're talking to maybe a politician, for instance, who's not telling the truth, how you frame that, what my colleague at NYU, Jay Rosen, would call a truth sandwich, frame what's perhaps challengeable with context. There are plenty of ways in which news organizations can connect better, I think, with the communities and with sources. I think that just prioritizing reaching people where they are with high value, high quality information is really important. And also recognizing that they are not trusted and thinking about different ways to mitigate that trust. Has anyone done it completely effectively yet? No. We would hope that in the next 4 years that we could address that.
Thank you. And then I'm going to one more question briefly of Ms. Urquiza. I've been troubled particularly by the degradation of science, and we've seen, whether it's climate change, public health, or with COVID-19, there are not two sides, in my opinion, when it comes to the acceptance of basic facts, particularly facts that are verified and backed by objective scientific methodology. So I wanted to start off by saying that I'm so sorry for the loss of your father, and I'm sure he would be proud to see you here today. But do you think in a minute that there's any way that some media outlets, when they're portraying as being two sides to the seriousness of COVID-19, whether and how to take precautions against this virus has blurred the danger it actually poses? Like, should you really be getting two sides on the virus when the facts are known? And doesn't it blur when you were trying to get a message out about the COVID and how to crush it?
I'm happy to weigh in on that. That facts are facts. There are no such thing as alternative facts, and even free speech scholars argue that for a democracy to function, informed debates and the marketplace of ideas must work off a shared set of facts. When it comes to science, science is truth, and there are not two sides to what science tells us. I think part of the problem.
All right, Kristin, I'm going to have to cut you short because I promised to give Jerry some time.
Of course.
So I apologize.
No worries.
Jerry, you have the remaining time for what it's worth. Go ahead.
I thank the chairman for yielding to me on this. Rampant disinformation and conspiracy theories that we witnessed to overturn the election results led to the insurrection on the United States Capitol and posed a grave threat to our safety, security, and way of life. But the foundation of our democracy is rooted in truth. Any effort to undermine that truthfulness is an effort to undermine and dismantle our democracy. We should all be concerned about any source that helps spread disinformation, conspiracy theory, and lies. And that's why I sent a letter with Representative Eshoo asking cable, satellite, and streaming providers the questions to understand how disinformation spreads and the role of various companies in enabling its spread. While social media undoubtedly plays a major role in enabling disinformation ecosystems, traditional media outlets should not escape scrutiny or accountability. I'm pleased to have this hearing I appreciate your testimony, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
And Mr. Doyle, Chairman Doyle has returned, so I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now want to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate that. And before I start my questions to Professor Turley, first of all, I want to just say that, reading your document that you presented to us is very enlightening. That we have to remember, as a student of history, it's so important to remember what happened in our founding days, especially with the Sedition Acts and the Adams administration. The founding of those early newspapers with Hamilton and with Jefferson and Madison, and what was going on back and forth through the Civil War, the Espionage Act under Wilson, that we see all these things reoccurring in what we're seeing being brought forward today. And one of the things I remember being taught in school years ago in college, that as a history major, is that he who forgets the past is condemned to repeat it. And Professor Turley, again, I want to thank you for being with us today in your defense of the Constitution. The Democrat hearing memo for today states that despite criticism, many traditional media outlets continue to allow for the disinformation in an attempt to follow journalistic standards and present multiple viewpoints on a news story. How would silencing one or more of those viewpoints, as the memo seems to imply would be helpful, actually hurt the ability of the media to correct the facts, to educate and inform the public?
Well, it wouldn't. Part of the value of a free press is the diversity of opinions and also the multiplicity of sources that it allows as exposure of lies. And lies tend to die from exposure. Sometimes it takes too long for most of us, as most of us would wish. But if you start to eliminate those viewpoints, you don't create better speech, you just create coerced or official speech. My problem with the letter is that it only talks about networks that are viewed as conservative leaning. The CNN, MSNBC, other networks have also been criticized for bias and criticized for false stories. And I think they have tried to address those issues, as have other networks. But to just focus on one part of that industry to try to either curtail or eliminate them is not advancing the interest of free speech. It's advancing the interest of a type of official speech or regulated speech.
Let me follow up. We've heard from some of our other witnesses today about the need for Congress to shed light on how irresponsible media contributes to disinformation in ways that have consequences for the democracy, and encourage public education that helps the public discern between fact and fiction. Yet some of my Democrat colleagues prefer to cancel certain news channels. How does government oversight of the media align with the First Amendment principles?
Well, this is not a new issue. If you look at the origins of the free press values that we hold dear, as well as free speech, they go back to the fight of John Milton in the 1600s, when he was fighting official licensing laws, laws that allowed the government to dictate who would be published. And this is like a dormant virus in our system. There's always a new generation and new interest in trying to regulate the free press to produce a more pleasing or acceptable or less objectionable product. That never works. What it does is it produces an official product, which is exactly what the free press is designed to avoid.
Well, a follow-up to that, what do you think is the appropriate role of the government in working to combat the disinformation that exists out there?
Well, there's a lot that can be done. To be frank, as I think Soledad O'Brien stated correctly, the view of the press among the public is at an all-time low. 40% may be optimistic at this point in terms of people who trust the media. The question is why? That's not just the conservative media, that's the media across the spectrum. And part of it is this echo journalistic model that has been replicated throughout the industry. They also don't trust Congress. Quite frankly, they don't trust this committee or other committees. And we have to accept that. And what we should do is try to create forms of information that are reliable for the public to reach their own conclusions, not to give them processed conclusions, but to give them that essential data and information, to give transparency to investigations. And then I think that trust can rebuild, not only with the media, but also with Congress.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate your testimony today. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired and I yield back.
I thank my friend for yielding back. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Ms. O'Brien, in your testimony, you talk about the weakening of journalistic standards throughout the media and the rise of anchors and commentators more intent on enraging their viewers than informing them. What's the danger when content is presented to viewers as news or as facts that really amounts to entertainment without a factual basis or any journalistic standards? Do you believe that this has exacerbated the pandemic, and do you think it helped foment the insurrectionist attack on January 6th?
I think you fail in your journalism when you do not actually do what the job is, which is to bring facts to people. And listen, first of all, I just want to say I'm incredibly proud to be a journalist. I work with many great colleagues, and there are many good news organizations, large and small, local TV stations, newspapers, big and small, and I'll name some of them. I think Report for America is quite good. Hechinger Report is quite good. ProPublica is quite good. They're elevating, and they are reporting, frankly, around the country. And I think probably the biggest issue is that there's just not enough of them, right? So when you have misinformation and when you have lies elevated, we talk about more speech and good speech and better speech. I think the actual conversation is about the risks of elevating lies. My conversation is about facts and lies. And so I think that you should not be allowed, and this should be through the news organization, should not want people to be on the air if they are in fact lying and they are liars. This should be because the news organization's values are to inform their public. Sometimes you get the sense that truth is unknowable. That is just not correct. I am advocating for good journalism. I am advocating for reporting, which is how we verify information. And we do not need to put people who are spreading misinformation on the air. And I think that is nothing that the Congress has to deal with. It is news organizations themselves who should hold themselves to this standard. It's a journalistic standard.
Right, thank you. What about you, Ms. Bell? Do you have anything to add to that? You need to unmute.
My students will be laughing at me now. So I think this point about better speech, good speech, the checks and balances of having a balanced market, it's really important that we understand how difficult that is in a digital environment. Some of the networks we look at, which are partisan, they exist on both the left and the right, that don't disclose their funding, that operate at local levels. They create 1 million stories in the course of a year. They contain very little original reporting. They're designed to get people to think about the repetition of phrases and think that things are issues that are not really issues. You can create an enormous amount of that material, and you can actually target it at people very, very cheaply and easily. And the job then of journalists on the ground becomes incredibly difficult. We see this showing up in local newsrooms all the time. So we hear from editors and reporters saying, you know, increasingly half of my job is just combating stuff, which is not true. And that's a narrative that I've heard a lot from reporters in places like Ukraine, places like Russia, is really not something that you expect to hear in the US. So I think it's not just about this partisan issue. I think we really do have to understand that the environment does not support and promote the things that are based in truth in the way that it should. And that's about incentives in all areas, I think, of the market.
Yeah, it seems like more free speech just isn't winning the day over the kind of speech that we're concerned about, unfortunately. Ms. Urquiza, first of all, my condolences to you and your family. This pandemic has taken many people's family and friends and loved ones away from us. And I appreciate you appearing today because I know this must be tough for you. I want to ask you, do you think your father's story is unique? And what role do you think the news media played in delivering what was an untimely, deadly disinformation to your father?
My father's story is absolutely not unique. I've, over the course of the many, many months, have been hearing similar and eerie stories from literally hundreds of people across the country who have come to Marked by COVID looking for support to figure out how to push forward. And my dad's message is to me started to change as the news media started to say that it was safe advertising the messaging coming from the White House that we didn't have anything to fear from. I know exactly that that was a huge role in him making the decisions that he made.
Yeah, thank you very much. I see my time is up. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. McMorris-Rodgers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing, along with the majority's letters that target right-wing cable outlets, are really a dangerous escalation in the left's crusade to silence anyone who does not agree with their ideology. It appears to me that the Democrats may want to revive the fairness doctrine. And Mr. Turley, so I wanted to start by asking you, can you explain the significant issues you see with a new fairness doctrine and why you would caution Congress against bringing it back?
Jonathan, you need to unmute. We can't hear you.
I don't know how many times I have to be told that, but I'm sorry. The questioning a fairness doctrine for the media sounds a lot like questioning a purity doctrine for milk. It's hard to explain, but there is a substantial question as to whether the fairness doctrine would be upheld today based on the earlier decision. It was upheld in 1969 in the Red Lion case. Now, I must confess, I don't favor the fairness doctrine because I don't favor government regulation of the media. I adhere to the view of Justice Hugo Black when he said, I take no law abridging to mean no law abridging, in quoting the First Amendment. That's why many people treat me as, often refer to me as a free speech and free press purist in that sense, something that I take as a compliment. But in Red Lion, the court applied an intermediate scrutiny standard that many of us have questioned as to whether that was appropriate. It based its decision on the notion that broadcast networks were unique medium. They were a scarce source of news, that people didn't have the ability to choose between news, and it was free, that this was available to the public. And so they decided to apply a lower standard. It's not clear they would do that again in cases like in 1974 in Miami Herald Publishing versus Chernillo. The court struck down a Florida law requiring newspapers to give space to people who were criticized or attacked. And but also we now don't have that scarcity, right? We have cable news that's more variety.
Thank you. I want to get to a couple more questions. So I wanted to ask all the witnesses that are here, and this is a yes or no question. Do you support government pressure on private companies to remove legally protected content from their viewing platforms? I'd like each of you to answer yes or no, please.
No.
Thank you.
No. I don't support government regulation in that sense.
Great. Yeah, as has been referenced, earlier this week, certain members of the majority sent a very concerning letter to companies pressuring them to block conservative outlets. And I know we've heard a lot from people on both sides of the aisle about the importance of upholding First Amendment. I'd like to offer this letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
To be clear, combating disinformation is a shared goal, but we do not want to follow the lead of authoritarian countries like China, not here in the United States where we cherish an independent press. So Mr. Turley, do you agree that the answer to speech we disagree with is more speech rather than less? And would you just explain briefly?
I do, and I think history shows that. What history shows also is that limiting speech, trying to regulate it through private or public means, tends not to produce better speech. It tends to produce regulated or official or approved speech. It tends to favor an orthodoxy. And that's the reason many of us oppose government regulation of the media, which is inherently at odds. And going back, as I mentioned, to the 1600s, the very foundation of a free press was formed in this conflict between the press and the government and trying to keep the government from exercising these controls. But it takes a leap of faith. You have to believe not just in the free press and free speech, you have to believe in each other to that we can make the right decisions. And it's not always the case. It doesn't always turn out the right way. There are a lot of people that aren't convinced. Many of us said soon after the election that there was not systemic fraud. A lot of people didn't believe that, but free speech allows them to be convinced.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Finally, just to Mr. Chairman, you once wrote, quote, censoring or interfering with broadcasters' discretion to air legally protected content is wrong, and threats by politicians about protected speech were concerning, and that anyone who, quote, stays silent could undermine the First Amendment and our Communications Act. So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say we need to be united in our effort to uphold the Constitution. We need to work together and not use our positions of power to threaten private companies to censor or interfere with constitutionally protected content. And so we stand ready to work together to protect these constitutionally protected freedoms of speech and the press.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chairman for holding this very important and informative discussion. It's important to talk about these things. My district includes the city of Stockton, California, with a population of over 300,000 people. It's the most racially and ethnically diverse city in the country. And here's what we're seeing in Stockton. In 2010, the Stockton Record, our local paper, had a staff of about 80 people. Today, it has a staff of 8. When we look at the total number of reporters in the city, region, and state that covers our metropolitan area, we see the same trend. In 2010, there were 100 to 110 reporters in print. In broadcasting today, there are 10 to 20. I'm concerned about how this decline of local news is impacting our community. Ms. O'Brien, when there are fewer reporters covering everyday life in a community, and there's less local reporting, how does this affect the ability of individuals to stay informed?
Clearly, it's a huge problem, and those numbers that you're talking about in Stockton, California are repeated across the country. It is devastating, and part of the problem is that people aren't only just getting misinformation or disinformation, they're also just getting no information, and so that becomes very problematic. There are real costs to that. How do you make decisions? How do you make decisions around policy? How do you make decisions about what's happening in your community? Local news, local newspapers specifically, were very much the way to do that. And because they're being decimated, there are some real tangible results of that. And those tangible results are devastating to communities, small communities.
Well, when there are local cuts to local newsrooms, how does this impact the ethnic diversity of the news cadre? And how could not having a diverse news staff impact trust in the press?
I've spent a lot of time reporting stories about diverse communities. And I think one thing we see is that diversity in the newsroom helps to actually get out more accurate stories, more interesting stories from diverse communities. So there is a real cost. Often, since many, and I don't know how it is in Stockton, but since many reporters of color are sometimes more recently hired, that often means that if there are layoffs, they are pretty quickly fired. And that means that your newsroom reverts back to not a particularly diverse newsroom. There, of course, is a tremendous cost to that. How do you cover a community that is growing more and more diverse without the staff that actually can navigate that? And how do you make sure that you are showing the public day in and day out that you care about the community when you're not actually there to cover their stories? It's hugely problematic.
Thank you. Professor Bell, how does a void in local news contribute to the spread of disinformation?
Well, I think in every dimension, it's exactly right that just as Soledad O'Brien just said, you know, we've done research in urban Philadelphia, we've done it in rural Kansas. You have really, really different populations there, but the thing that they share in common is that they feel like journalism was something which just was traditionally done to them, not for them. They have low expectations of the press. They have little trust in it. And I think the problem is, and then you lose support for local media. And local media does actually keep government accountable. It keeps expenditure down. It keeps, I mean, all of this is kind of provable. It's in the evidence. And I think the other thing, which is sociological, which is really important to say here, which is that if you're from one of the communities, if you're from your area that you represent, and you are a young person with ambition to serve their community, and particularly if you're a young person who's not properly represented in the press, you're not going to look at the moment at local press and think that is a great, stable path for me to follow. So, you know, I think that losing that step of the first step of accountability in democracy, really it means that almost everything else in the pyramid of media is standing on a very faulty foundation. I think we really, you can't overestimate how important it is as a foundation of democracy.
Thank you. Well, for consumers with cable subscriptions, channels are typically bundled and consumers can't opt out of paying for certain channels, even if they don't want the channel. I recently wrote a letter with Representative Eshoo that's been referred to today, expressing grave concern about how some of these channels are spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories. Professor Bell, have consumers, even those who do not want to watch these channels, been paying for disinformation?
The economics of bundling and cable carriage does mean that inevitably you end up paying as a consumer for things that you wouldn't necessarily pay for otherwise. So in that dimension, yes.
Well, it should be noted that a lot of Americans don't realize they are paying for disinformation. Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the recognition. My daughter just graduated from journalism school, so this is important to me. She's going to start a career in a great field, and it's important that we have honesty and integrity in journalism. And I have a lot of people home asking me quite often, what news should I watch? I mean, I think some people realize that we've divided ourselves into news for one belief and the news for the other, which one to watch. And it's difficult for me to say. And I always say that if you had two conspiracies, both of them conspiracies. One is that there were emergency measures put in place on mail-in voting in certain states, and that mail-in voting had irregularities that changed the election. And the other one is the Russian president hijacked the American election because he had information on the American president to make him an agent of the Russian government. Which one do you think would get investigated and which one do you think would get summarily dismissed? We know that the Russian investigation was false. We know that members of Congress were on television, cable shows saying they had evidence that the president, that was all true. They were never called out on it. And so it's just frustrating that if we're looking at one side or the other, it's both sides, and we really need to focus on this. And the question is, as we get to here, is where's Congress's role in doing it and given the First Amendment. And so I want to focus on, and I think what Ms. Urquiza was talking about, I'm the ranking member of the healthcare subcommittee of this committee. And it's important that we get accurate information. It absolutely is important we get accurate information out. During the Operation Warp Speed phase, when they were developing the vaccines, we had members of this committee, we had the vice president, current vice president of the United States, talk about the process of Operation Warp Speed and getting the vaccines in a negative way, in my opinion. And it just really frustrated me because everybody who wanted to know knew FDA was following the standards of every other vaccine. That was evident. And by spreading disinformation, if somebody chooses not to get a vaccine because they heard somebody from this committee or they heard the vice president earlier, and that was during the campaign season, not during our current vice presidency, it really does lend to people making decisions that Ms. Urquiza was talking about that's not with the best information. And so the question you get to, if we say, well, only people that have this information can go talk on television, what do we tell the politicians that spread disinformation? Do we tell them in the course of a campaign they can't make those kind of comments? And so we're all for the right information. And the question, I guess, with with Dr. Turley, I went and visited there's a vaccine site in my district where they were doing the experimentation. I go in, and the researcher, the lady who was doing all the set up the research and the tests and so forth, really kind of excoriated me, and we deserved it on the political side for politicizing the process in the square. I mean, she corrected me, said this shouldn't be political. This is where we're moving forward, and she really brought forth. And I said, you're right. It shouldn't be political. We should have answers. And then the two physicians who were responsible for the practice where she was doing the administration, one sat down and said, children can spread this, and children need to be vaccinated and so forth. And I won't get into it. Where the other one completely contradicted what he said. Two physicians in the same practice sitting in the same room. And I looked to the researcher, I said, see, this is the problem we're having getting information out. So the question, I guess, Dr. Turley, if there are two opinions, I mean, how do you get to the point where we say, we know this is safe and effective, we know that all of the criticisms against the vaccine are wrong, therefore what process would you say would Congress have in place to say only the people telling what we know to be true can go on television? I don't understand how we would do that practically.
Well, I don't think you could do that, and I don't think the courts would allow you to do that under the First Amendment. But the way you resolve that is you have to convince people, and that's never easy, right? It's very frustrating because some people won't be convinced. I actually felt it was very important in the days following the election to say, let's look at all of these allegations, while also saying that we didn't see any evidence of systemic fraud. Just say we'd like to look at them. There was a whole group of people that were within a couple of days of the election saying there's no fraud, no irregularities, and even threatening lawyers and trying to get them to drop these cases. That didn't help. That didn't help convince people, because what they saw was a bunch of people trying to silence others. And I think it snowballed into what we saw, that both sides were not listening or speaking to the others. So those of us who are in the middle in the media have to try to do our best to try to frame these issues to convince people. It's not as easy as silencing some voices. It's not as easy as marginalizing voices. But it's the only thing that can unify us, is to find avenues for dialogue. Congress can play a role in that by trusting citizens enough to give them greater transparency, greater information, that they can make their own decisions. And I want to echo what the Democratic member said before, and also what my co-panelists said. I also believe that the loss of local media is a serious problem. And that's another area where Congress really could play a good role in focusing on how we can get back to a robust local media.
Yeah, gentleman's time is expired.
I'm sorry, my time's expired. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A top 10 of facts that we saw contested vigorously over the last year. COVID-19 is real and can kill you. Masks protect us. Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are safe and effective. Joe Biden won the presidential election. There were no massive instances of voter fraud. It was Trump supporters that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. There are 530 members of Congress that are capitalists and about 5 that are Democratic Socialists. The federal government infected Black men with syphilis from 1932 to 1972. A third of Puerto Rican women were forced sterilized from 1930 to 1970, both by the federal government. And lastly, the earth is still round. I say this because you see so many of these facts were the subject of intense campaigns of misinformation in social media, in newspapers, in broadcasting, and I get we have to strike a balance on this. First, I want to ask Ms. O'Brien, who obviously has the show Matter of Fact, about how important it is to get the facts right, particularly regarding COVID-19, vaccines, and other key public health facts when it comes to communicating with communities of color.
Clearly, it's absolutely essential, especially for vulnerable populations, because obviously when there's lots of misinformation or disinformation or just flat out lies, then you run the risk that people are making decisions off of this misinformation. On the show that I do, Matter of Fact, we've consistently been dipping back into communities of color to talk to them about their fears, their concerns, and talking to experts as well as we follow what's happening with the vaccine. I think it's really critical. But I think it's essential to remember that robust dialogue is great. It just has to be robust dialogue around facts. This idea that, speech and more speech, all great, as long as it's centered in facts. And I think we should be really clear to tease out misinformation and disinformation and lies are very different than people just having disagreements over a set of facts.
And what do you think the consequences could be of continued massive falsehoods regarding vaccines and COVID-19 among communities of color?
We've already seen many communities of color are very slow to get access to the vaccine. Sometimes that's structural, and sometimes it's because they have had a history of distrust in the medical profession. And so there are already concerns there. And it's one of the reasons we keep dipping back into this story consistently, almost every other week, to make sure we're elevating that conversation.
Thank you so much. Professor Turley, it's great to see you again. Enjoyed your classes at GW Law. Always a pleasure to have you in committee. We saw a huge Spanish language misinformation campaign in South Florida, in particular in our state, blaming Antifa and BLM for the Capitol insurrection. The FCC already has laws in the books that if you knowingly broadcast false information that will cause substantial public harm, that it's illegal. Is this one of the proper ways we could pursue making sure that we have some truth in broadcasting and existing laws? Would that be a way to strike that balance by the FCC looking at and beefing up their Spanish language staff?
Well, thank you again, Congressman. It's good to see you again. I wish I could say that was a potential avenue. I don't think it is a workable avenue because it quickly gets bound up in this sort of regulation of the media and can trip these same wires under the First Amendment. There are protections, of course. You do have defamation laws, even with public figures. You can sue people. We've had a whole plethora of lawsuits recently, including by Dominion Computers, which has been suing a number of people about falsehoods that have been made. Those do have deterrent impacts. They do have an impact on media as well as non-media figures. The most important role of Congress is to be a vehicle of truth, to get that information out, and to allow the media to filter out these voices. I'm not as confident as Soledad. I have to say that I don't think it's fair to say, well, look, I'm in favor of free speech and free press as long as you're not a liar, as long as what you're saying is not untrue. And it gets us back, it's sort of circular because we end up in the same spot. Who's the arbiter of that? What is the meaning that someone's a liar and someone is being untruthful?
Thank you, Professor. And I want to give Mr. O'Brien.
The gentleman's time is, you have 4 seconds, so.
My time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes. Adam, you're up.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks everybody for being here. One of the interesting, when we talk about truth, I think, when you think back to COVID, I've had people that have sent me, well, how come there's 500,000 that have died from COVID and flu deaths are way down? And that is seen as some kind of a thing that this is really the flu. And, you just got to remind people because we're all wearing masks and keeping distance, and that's how the flu passes. So I do want to say to our panelists who lost a family member and anybody else, I am truly sorry and devastated, and I hope you can find some solace in the work you're doing. Lots of what we're talking about, I think the important part here is we look back at past actions and we do a lot of whataboutism. Well, Democrats did this, and the Democrats say the Republicans did this, and you're never going to win an argument that way. I think in the future of disinformation, the key is to call it out in your own party. I'll tell you, if some of you lefties on this panel, call my base and tell them something, they're not going to listen to you. But if I say it, they're much more likely to. And I think that's where it's important for each party and each political philosophy to take a personal account for what you are telling your constituents and people that are listening to you. Because I got to tell you, as much as this debate is important, if this society falls apart, we're going to look back and say, not just we could have done more, we're going to say all the things we argued about were nothing in comparison to the fact that now society has failed and my dad can't get his heart medicine or something like that. So this is deadly serious. And I think it's important for everybody to remember this is far beyond what it means for the next election and who's going to win the majority and anything like that. And we need a 10-part series to cover the way that government officials, media, and the public have contributed to this. But I think we need to focus today on fear and anger associated with our discourse. The national news media has a substantial role in society, but over time we've seen traditional news reporting devolve into opinion reporting. Too often national news outlets give primetime slots to opinion personalities over news reports. And some of these personalities will start a segment by reporting the top lines of a current event, but then they quickly transition and spend more time on expressing their political hot take on the matter. They point figures, they create, political narratives, and more time on that than they do offering important background and details and letting you make your own decision. Plus the fact that we're being hit from every front with all kinds of information. Eventually, it's like if you're being attacked on three sides, you're just going to jump into a foxhole and hide and listen to the one person that maybe you trust, and that person can now take a hold of anything you believe and tell you anything. There's plenty of evidence to show that fear-mongering and fomenting anger drives engagement and ratings. We know that. And similar constructs, of course, can be applied to social media. Ultimately, this fosters a culture of fear and clickbait to get attention. Civility is not limited to the words we choose or to the tone that we employ. It means respecting one another as equals through our shared humanity. And as it applies to this hearing, civility means prioritizing the reporting of facts over opinions and then trusting the public to interpret the events for themselves and assign the right value. I do want to make a general distinction, though, again, between national and local media, as was discussed. There's always exceptions, but I got to tell you, I'm a big fan of local media and local news. I think it's very fact-based. It can show people, where to get the latest vaccine, what's going on. I think the degradation or the disappearing of local news is a real concern. They also can play a very good role, as we've seen, in exposing scams that are out there that we've seen, for instance, of seniors and others. So I'm all for keeping it local. I do want to ask, though, Professor Turley, mis and disinformation have to be addressed in a bipartisan fashion. We know that foreign actors utilize both to sow the seeds of discord and to threaten democracies across the globe. And at the same time, the most important principle of democracy is the freedom of speech and expression. But I worry that we are crossing into yelling fire in a theater if it is this dangerous. So let me ask you, I'm interested in exploring the legal ways to curb disinformation and protect the First Amendment. Given the important role the media has, what do you think about these outlets having to make it clear to their audience when their segments are opinion versus fact?
Well, I think that is important. There's a blurring that has occurred. If you go past 6 o'clock on most cable networks, you're pretty much in the realm of opinion today, and it does blur. And I think what you said earlier, Congressman, is really important. Let's be honest. Rage is addictive. I mean, we are a nation addicted to rage. People complain about how tired they are and how they wish they could get beyond this, but I don't see any evidence of it. People are addicted to rage, and they're using that rage to try to silence others or blame others, and it's ripping this country apart. The media can play a very important role in trying to create a dialogue, and that's all the media, the diversity of media that we have, and the Congress can help in that sense.
That's right. Well, it's a battle.
Gentleman's time has expired. Sorry, Adam.
I yield back. Thank you.
Okay, buddy. Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for putting together this very important hearing. Mr. Chairman, the spread of misinformation and disinformation strikes at the heart of our democracy. Without the ability to discern what is true from what is not, or the ability to even work from the same shared sets of facts, there's no way we can earnestly debate the important and complex issues that impact our constituents every day. I could go on, Mr. Chairman, but I think there's been a lot of commentary in this area already. I'll just jump straight to my question so we have enough time to have a little bit of a conversation. I'd like to start with Ms. O'Brien. Some have argued that equal time should be given to competing sides of controversial issues. I tend to agree with that generally, but in practice it seems awfully difficult. How do broadcast journalists and media sources in general give equal time to each side of an issue without vindicating those whose opinions are not based in facts?
So I covered this in my written testimony, so I refer back to that. But I would say that I think debate around facts is great. And I am absolutely a proponent of debating. I think where we see a difference is when we're not dealing with facts and we're dealing with something that is dishonest and a lie. So I do not believe that lies deserve equal time. And I think that journalism students from pretty much day one are able to begin to ferret out what things are true. It's reporting, right? It's the who, why, what, when, where, how. And so for me, that is really how it needs to be thought about. Facts are not unknowable. It's not this who knows what's real, who knows what's not real. There are verifiable facts, and in fact, those can be the center of a very good and engaging and important debate that will engage your viewers, that will help them make decisions, that will help your constituents. But when those things that are being debated are actually based on misinformation and lies, there is no obligation to elevate a lie, ever. There is no one in a news organization who would say that that is the mission of journalism, to elevate and platform lies.
Thank you, ma'am. Turning to Ms. Bell, do you think that climate change and the potential consequences of allowing the spread of inaccurate or just simply wrong information has similar parallels and dangers as to what we saw with the spread of misinformation regarding the COVID-19 virus and the 2020 election? And add on to that, please. Do you think there should be some sort of immediate action? And if so, what should that action be to combat disinformation?
So I think climate change is a very useful parallel here. And again, when we are debating or finding out more about a complex environment, then there's always an area where things are under debate. The consensus of the scientific community on climate change and what's needed to mitigate it is pretty much solidified at this point. But we still see, I mean, even last week in Texas, we saw, unfortunately, lots of pretty, I think, balanced discussion right the way across the political spectrum about what the problems with power supply were. We saw a narrative emerge about wind turbines, which was not actually reflective of the true situation of what had happened. And you can just trace how those stories were proliferated in one place and then amplified online until it became the dominant narrative rather than the real problems and the real sort of suffering that people were experiencing on the ground. So I think climate change is one of those areas, exactly like health, where we just need, and I think Texas is important in this because, again, local outlets, the governor of Texas went to local news and talked about, I think, the issues in a much more balanced way. He went on to Sean Hannity in the evening, and it was all about wind turbines again. So I think that, kind of, we all have to, I think local media does a great job of keeping people accountable when there's enough of it, and when it's properly paid. The job here is to think about some of the incentive structures and what we can do to positively regulate rather than negatively regulate, rather than saying, let's ban certain amounts of speech. I don't think anybody here is in favor of that. How do we make sure that that type of journalism and those type of systems, because it's not just the journalists, are actually really encouraged?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin. Let's see. Looks like my buddy Gus Bilirakis is next. Gus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I want to tell you, I want to invite you down to Florida for spring training. It begins this weekend. So, again, I'm the eternal optimist with regard to the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Well, I'll tell you, Gus, with the weather we've had in Pittsburgh, I'll come tomorrow.
Professor Turley, in 1987, the FCC repealed the Fairness Doctrine. I know you know that, which required that television stations air contrasting views to controversial issues. The justification for the Fairness Doctrine was that in 1967, Americans only had access to a handful of broadcasting stations which were granted licenses by the federal government. I remember all that. I'm old enough. If your viewpoint was attacked and you didn't have an opportunity to respond, you might never have been able to defend yourself back in 1967. In 2021, we're no longer limited to a few TV stations, and Americans are increasingly relying on other forms of media to inform their views. Given the exponential ways Americans can access news and opinions in 2021, do we really need the fairness doctrine in order to ensure opposing voices are heard? And are there constitutional concerns with the fairness doctrine today that might not have existed in 1967? Again, for Professor Turley.
Yes, thank you. This may have bearing because I'll have to answer your question as a Cubs fan. So as a Pirates fan, you may want to discount everything I'm about to say. But there are serious concerns. I have really substantial doubts about whether Red Lion would be upheld in its original form, if at all. The first issue is really this intermediate scrutiny standard that was applied instead of strict scrutiny. But you really hit on the key in terms of the changing context. Back then, the Supreme Court put a lot of emphasis on the fact that there were very few broadcast networks, very few choices, and therefore it elevated the interest of the government. But the court also said that if there's evidence that there isn't that scarcity, then that can be put forward, or if there's evidence that they are controlling the message. The objection I made to the letter that went to AT&T actually is the same objection that goes to Red Lion. That letter seems like an effort to encourage the dropping of some of these cable news programs, to actually reduce the diversity of cable programs. But if the Supreme Court was to deal with this today, I think it would see a very different situation, and I think it would adopt a different analysis. There's a variety of choices on cable as well as broadcast, and I think they could very well not only change the standard, but the outcome, particularly as it applies to cable.
Thank you. Next question. In a free market, when a product or service continually fails to meet an expected standard, the public either moves to a competitor or the opportunity for a new market competitor arises. You touched on that. I believe the system extends to journalistic standards as well. If an outlet fails to report the truth and damages its reputation as a reputable network, its viewers will seek out its competition. Professor Turley, again, if the government were to pull competitors from the news market and then prevent new competitors from entering, doesn't that lower accountability and journalistic standards than would otherwise exist in an open market for the entities that remain?
Well, that indeed is the concern, because if you go down that road, you come close to the state media model. That is, it's not enough to control the narrative. You also have to eliminate alternatives to the narrative, right? Because it doesn't work if people can just go to another source and hear a different view. So that's part of the value of the diversity of these news outlets that you can choose from. Now, we do have a serious problem here. My co-panelist touched on this, that we have a new model of this echo journalism. People have these siloed existences. And echo journalism is like the comfort food of journalism, right? People go to these comfort zones where they only hear news that confirms their bias. And a lot of these networks are shaped by that. And a lot of us want to see some breakage there to try to get back to that. But we have to convince people to do that. You don't do that by eliminating or curtailing other news sources. You do that by trying to work with responsible journalism and journalists in elevating that news.
Gentlemen's time has expired.
Yeah, somebody did say
Gentlemen's
we
time
have
has
a responsibility as well. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Gus, we don't pay attention to American League teams. All right, let's see who's next here. My good friend Anna Eshu, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. And Mr. Turley, I'm sorry that yours came in late, so I couldn't read it last night, but I did today. I want to just take a minute or so for my observations, because I've been listening since we began. And it's always worthwhile to listen and to listen well. I think that today's hearing about misinformation and listening to a lot of things that have been said simply underscores that we have a lot of misinformation going on right in the middle of this very hearing. The letters that Congressman McNerney and I sent, some have insisted that those letters violate the First Amendment. The First Amendment, my friends, starts with 4 words: Congress shall make no laws. So those of you who may not have read the letters, I suggest that you do. I would also like to state that the letter asks the companies questions. Now, I don't know, Mr. Turley, if you find this so chilling that it's actually glacial for Congress to ask strong, important questions. I think we owe that to Ms. Urquiza. How do you answer to what was put out and her father is gone? I call them lies. I don't know what you call them. You call that the open market, something that's competitive? We have a problem in this country. It's a large one. It's a sticky wicket because of our Constitution. But we need to examine and be frank with each other about what is taking place in the country. I'd also like to add that if you want assurance, members, Mr. McNerney and I have the nonpartisan First Amendment experts at CRS, the Congressional Research Service, read every word and every footnote of our letters and review them against all relevant case law. They're finalizing a legal analysis memo, which I will share with all the members of the committee. Yesterday, CRS informed me they see no First Amendment red flags in the letters whatsoever. So I thank my Republican pals for elevating this hearing. I think we have a much broader audience because of the red herrings that have been raised or put out there before the hearing. So we have a terrific audience. As I said, probably larger than what we originally anticipated. To Ms. O'Brien, I think your testimony is magnificent. And I think that your term that we have truth decay today couldn't be better capsulized. Now, Newsmax, One America News Network, Fox News, all use, quote, news in their name. As a well-respected journalist of 30 years, how do you define the word news?
For me, news is about searching for verifiable, accurate, factual information and bringing that to the public. I think journalists spend every day, good journalists at least, trying to figure out how they can serve their public, how they can bring accuracy and facts and nuance and context to the people who are watching them or reading them. And to me, that is news. Now, CNN also has news in its headline as well. So I don't think it's as much as what's in the headline. I think it's what is the actual practice that you are seeing day in and day out. Many news organizations, as I have in my written testimony, have slid into a lot of opinion. An opinion that's not necessarily labeled as opinion or highlighted as opinion or sort of pointed out strongly as opinion. Instead, it just sort of slides into opinion, and it's very hard to tell the difference. I think it does not serve the public to have two debating talking heads who are often not versed in facts, who are not experts debating.
You can actually interrupt you because I have a few seconds left. I'd like this to be understood. The idea that members asking questions violates the First Amendment is absolutely absurd. It's our job to ask questions. So I want to thank all of the witnesses Even though I don't agree with you, Mr. Turley, I thank you for coming up. Well, you're appearing on the Hill, but you're probably at home or in your office. But I appreciate it. And to Miss Urquiza, my daddy was the North Star of my life. And so I understand your aching heart. God rest him. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes Billy Long. Billy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to start out here in the spirit of the late, great John Dingell, asking a yes or no question to all of the panelists that we have here today, all of the witnesses. And Ms. O'Brien, yes or no, please. Do you support taking Fox News, Newsmax, and One American News off of the air?
Before I answer your question, I'm going to tell you, as a reporter, when I ask people yes or no questions, I'm trying to very directly force them into something that has no context whatsoever. So I will just note that for the committee here. I do not support that, is my answer.
Okay. And Ms. Bell, same question for you, yes or no. Do you support taking Fox News, Newsmax, or One American News off of the air?
I'm afraid it's going to be the same answer, which is yes or no questions don't necessarily serve the purpose of providing.
Okay, well, due to the time constraints, that's what I'm asking. So I'll go on from Ms. Urquiza, yes or no. Do you support taking Fox News, Newsmax, or One American News off of the air?
No.
Thank you. And Mr. Turley, same question for you. Do you support taking Fox News, Newsmax, or One American News off of the air?
No.
Thank you. I have a little story I'd like to tell here. It's a buddy of mine, a constituent, not a constituent, a colleague. He could move from Tennessee, I guess, if he wanted to, but I don't want to give you his name, but I'll give you his initials. His initials are Steve Cohen. And when Steve was a little boy, his father was a pediatrician. And his father came home one day and said, I'm going to vaccinate your older brother, who I believe was 7 years old at the time. Steve was 4. And Steve said, well, can I have the vaccine? This is with the polio. And his father said, no, it's not approved for anyone under 5 and you're 4. So he did not give Steve that vaccine. And 6 months later, Steve Cohen developed polio. So when we're talking about facts and science, and one of my colleagues also this morning, I'm not sure which one, said, should you be getting 2 sides on COVID since the science is clear? Miss on here, Miss Urquiza said, science is true. If science is true, which I don't, different people have their idea of what's true and what's not in science. Take, for instance, Robert Kennedy Jr. Robert Kennedy Jr. put out a tweet after Hank Aaron passed away, home run king. Hank Aaron's tragic death is part of a wave of suspicious deaths among early, closely following administration of COVID vaccine. He received the Moderna vaccine on January 5 to inspire other Black Americans to get the vaccine. And this was from an article from The Defender, Children's Health News, and Views, who were taking the position that 18 days before he deceased, Henry Aaron had received the vaccine, indicating that the vaccine was not safe. So, like I say, science, people have their different opinion on science. I know that people in my constituency, in my area, are calling me repeatedly daily, where can we get the vaccine? Where can we get the vaccine? So when you put stories out like this, that the vaccine is not safe, is that fake news? Is that the truth? Does it lie somewhere in the middle? So these are things that I don't think this hearing today is quite as cut and dry, black and white as people would like to think that it is. And as far as fake news and things that are put out, and some of you think that the center-right media is putting out false stories, I wonder about the sins of omission. And one of the sins of omission that I find is when the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler, said that we won't be counting false Biden claims. I assume he'll be like Obama and tell the truth. So if a network, a newspaper, news outlet decides that they're not going to report. I watch Morning Joe pretty much every morning when I'm getting ready on MSNBC. When the Hunter Biden story was coming down, I paid particular attention to see if they ever mentioned one time. This was, of course, before President Biden was sworn in, but, you know, if they ever mentioned Hunter Biden. And as far as I could tell, I'd never heard it. And like I say, I watch it daily, so I've never heard it uttered one time. Another, I say, sin of omission. So we have sins of omission where people don't report on facts and things that are coming out that they don't want to be known. And you have other people saying that, well, the right, center-right folks are reporting false news. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let's see. Next is gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and very glad that we're here today talking about disinformation and extremism in the media. And I want to be clear where I stand. I worry about this particularly as a Black American, and with this being Black History Month, let me just highlight some of how this has really turned violent and has not been good for people of color in this country historically. And I know that for a lot of people, this all centers around First Amendment. But let's go back to 1915. D.W. Griffith had a hit movie called Birth of a Nation that was presented as factual, that was presented as real. And much of the media of the day presented it as real and factual. And as a result of that, people went to the streets, targeted African Americans. There were riots, there were fires, because this information was presented as real. And part of the information in the movie was presented was that whites were victimized by Blacks in the form of voter fraud. And so you fast forward 106 years later in 2021, and you have people that decided they were going to come to the Capitol because of a lot of the similar disinformation that places like Atlanta and Milwaukee and Detroit victimized them and stole an election from them. And so trying to figure out the freedom of speech versus other people's safety, you know, what Oliver Wendell Holmes talked about, people's safety, how you distinguish between the two. I think that this is a very serious conversation that we're having. I wanted to ask Ms. O'Brien, are there any incentives that exist that can be used for journalists and publishers to bring more context and nuance to their news and commentary so that viewers can better understand what they are watching, especially when it comes to a lot of the more extreme views that can lead to violence?
So first, as you point out, the problem of misinformation isn't a new problem. It's not something that popped up a couple of years ago and now we're going to tackle it for the first time. Technology has obviously changed how that problem now gets to the public. And I think that's what brings us here to where we are today. I think there's this opportunity for journalists to do better. Often there are financial incentives that make journalists want to do better, or news organizations that hire journalists to do better. But actually, a lot of the way talk is, it actually financially is quite inexpensive. And so it is much cheaper to have dueling talking heads rather than having a long, contextual, nuanced, explanatory conversation. Like you, there was very upsetting to see the Confederate flag on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. That was very problematic to me as a biracial woman here in America. Lies obviously have real implications. To listen to Ms. Urquiza's testimony, it's heartbreaking, right? I mean, for everybody. And again, I don't think facts belong to a party. I don't think we should think of this as a partisan issue. Every single person, regardless of who votes for you, what state you're in, what side of the aisle you're on, you should want to have more facts and accuracy that's being disseminated to the people who voted you into office. That's what you should all want. So yeah, I agree with you. It's very problematic. At the end of the day, I think the pressure from the public will go a long way, not pressure from Congress, as I've said in my remarks, and I've reiterated a couple of times. I don't think the role of government is to do that. I think viewers have to say, no more elevating misinformation.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let's see. Markway Mullen, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for all the panel that's here today. And you know, obviously, this is about getting down to the problem we have with the media and with the social media as alike. And I appreciate the Democrats bringing this up. We've been talking about this for 4 years, especially with the whole Russia collusion narrative to which the media drawled for so many years, 4 years, in fact. And that was complete misinformation that was out there. And why I know this one seems to be focusing on Fox and left outlets. Ms. O'Brien, do you believe that MSNBC and CNN are also guilty of misinformation?
Sir, I'm concerned that you did not read my written testimony fully, or you would be able to know.
I read it.
I'm being sarcastic.
I want to hear it.
Absolutely. Yes, clearly. And I state that very clearly in my testimony that this is not an issue that is open.
But and Ms. O'Brien, I appreciate that, but its focus has been on Fox and the left media, and you have been very clear about where you lie on that. And I wanted to make it very clear. Your testimony absolutely made it clear on the written testimony, but I hadn't heard you say that. So I appreciate you stating that. Mr. Turley, as I stated before, after the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton, the left-wing media repeatedly talked about the Russia collusion and their interference within the election. And given this misinformation,
that I've been on it, I don't even think I've had a cold. Never mind the flu. Nothing close to the flu. I don't have any more of that confusion because what's in it is food. Fruits and vegetables are good for you. There's never going to be a dispute over that.
Start today by going to balanceofnature.com and use discount code FOXNEWS.
Democrats set to ram through a massive COVID relief bill, but Republicans are pointing out that many of the items in that bill have nothing to do with the pandemic. They're also pounding Democrats for not doing enough to reopen America's schools. Still, polling shows a majority of Americans do support more stimulus. So are Republicans taking the right tack with this? And are the others, those on the other side, will Democrats regret icing out Republicans on this issue? Let's bring in our panel, Jessica Tarlov and Sean Duffy joining us now. Sean, to you first on this. Republicans, they've stepped in and said, hey, we want to help. More help is needed. There's still struggling Americans out there. But what is it about this bill that you take issue with?
So first off, I think the polling is right. And most Americans, they want to get the $1,400 in stimulus checks, Sandra. They want to make sure there's money for vaccine distribution. But this is not about COVID and COVID relief. There's abortion money in this bill. There's foreign aid in this bill. We're going to do social justice farming aid. I'm from Wisconsin, where we have a lot of farmers. I don't know what that is. So this is a liberal progressive bill. And I think if you look at it, Sandra, it might sit really well today. But if you look and see how it ages, I don't think before the next election, which is a year and a half away, this will not age well as a